This is the story of the Britanniaville Manor. Thought it would be a cool video to put together some of the things I've learned over these last few years of living here. I was pretty interested in the history of the house when we first moved here, and then COVID happened. I learned a bit more, but then recently with this new YouTube channel, thought it'd be cool to revisit some of that history, and I've learned quite a bit more. So kind of go through the history of the house from what I've gathered. I'm sure I'll learn more over time, but this is what I know as of June 2023. So the story goes that a man named Henry Hudson Fish and his wife Eliza Ann Glazer, they sold this house and their land to their son Frank Leonard Fish. I had originally thought that they had built it for him, and I'm sure they did build it for him, but for free, essentially, as if a gift to their child. But I do have some records showing that he actually purchased it from them. So he bought it on February 14th, 1880. That's when it became when it came into his possession for $7,000, which is not a lot of money even back then. I was curious, so I looked up on the Department of Labor website what the equivalent would be for today's money, and it came to about $209,000. So you're talking nearly 2 acres of land, plus there's a reference to the property in the deed being on there, the dwelling. So for $7,000, $209,000 today, that's a pretty good deal, in my opinion. So he definitely got the family discount. But when I was doing the original research, I came across a distant family member, and she had explained to me that the parents had built it for their son at the time. So I don't know why, but I had just assumed it was free. Henry and Eliza, though, were pretty big supporters of the arts, and I think you'll see that theme throughout the history of this house, which I think is pretty cool. There's artistic flares throughout the house. Some were done by Eliza at the time. So Eliza was an artist in her own right, and some of her personal touches are hand-painted fireplace tiles, and I've learned this from that distant relative, saying that those tiles were put there by her. So that's cool. Also, those tiles are still here today, which I think is pretty awesome. They've made it this far. So from 1880, from when the house was built, and those were painted. As we'll go through the history of the house, there was some serious risk to not having these, and that distant relative was actually surprised that they still exist. She thought that they would have been gone. So I actually sent her a photo of them as they stand today, which is pretty cool. Some of the other unique touches of these tiles are some like hidden features almost. I thought it was cool, like this pussy willow shows some of the, I don't know what you call them, the little puffs of the plant. The little buds are actually cats, which I thought was cool, or kittens. So they stood this test of time, which is cool. It's my understanding that the Fish also were avid travelers, and there have been claims, some from previous residents of the house, that the fireplace mantles were imported ebony trees from Africa. Which, as of right now, there's 9 fireplaces throughout the house. So I don't know if that's true. I have no proof of those claims. But the other cool thing about some of these fireplaces are some hidden cubbies. Some of them are protected by a lock and key, which we still have the keys. So I imagine that those were there for keeping high valuable personal belongings. There's also, back then, that's how they heated the home. So there's all kinds of closets built in around the fireplaces. I imagine that's where they wanted to keep certain things warm in the winter, like like bedding or clothing, that kind of stuff, which I think is cool. Some of my other favorite attributes of this house are the attention to detail on some of the smaller things, like door handles and the hinges are all carved. There's also some gas light fixtures, which I don't know how original those are, but they're pretty old and they're still intact, which I think is pretty cool. So the Fish family, the ones who architected this homestead originally, they were pretty wealthy. So through research, I was able to determine that Henry was a second-generation stakeholder and operator of the Reed and Barton Silver Factory. So we live in a town which has been dubbed the Silver City, and specifically because this Reed and Barton Silver Factory, they do silver plating. I think it's still in business today, but not obviously at the scale that they were back then. They also at one point did silver medals for the Olympics, which I think is pretty cool history. So he was second-generation owner alongside Henry Reed and Charles Barton. At the time, the third man brought in was a guy named Gustavus Leonard. But when he passed in 1845, Henry Hudson Fish took his place. So it was a big company even back then, so he was pretty wealthy. Then when Henry died in 1882, that was only 2 years after the house was built, he passed his shares, his Reed and Barton shares, to his son Frank. It also said his brother George, which through some of my research, I couldn't find any siblings to Frank, which referenced, which I thought was interesting, that this one says that a man named George was his brother. So I would believe that, obviously. I couldn't find any reference to this George otherwise. So along with having 4 children, Frank was involved in a lot of things locally. He was the treasurer of a Young Men's Christian Association, which I imagine happened pretty early in his life since it's the Young Men Christian Association. He was the board of the park commissioners in 1907, so he was living in this house at that time. He was the first treasurer and officer, an officer of Mechanics Cooperative Bank, which is still in operation today. And they actually, there's a few of them right up the street from me. But they're relatively large bank at this point. They have lots of commercials on TV, and it's funny. Once I learned this, I kind of picture the president of the current bank. That's kind of how I envision Frank sounding.
Mechanics Cooperative Bank.
Let's keep it local.
So, in addition to being those things, he was a justice of the peace. So, I'm also curious if he had any weddings that he administered, which I think would be pretty cool. But in 1873, the new congregational church was installed on the grounds next to the plot because the house hadn't been built yet. But Frank was on the standing committee. By 1892, he was operating and participating in the musical services. So I don't know the timing of when Frank was on the standing committee, but he was big into music, big into the arts, similar to his parents. They were seen organizing things like musicales to be played at the house, which I think is cool, in an effort to secure building funds for the church. So I have this newspaper clipping from 1983 referencing a 100-year anniversary to one of those events. But what was also cool was I was able to find an image of the actual invitation on April 30th, 1883. So the newspaper clipping from 1983 referenced something that happened 100 years ago, and then I found the actual invitation that was from that date, April 30th, in 1883. So that was just 3 years after the house was built and purchased by Frank. So they had it in the parlor. The other cool thing about that is the parlor is that photo that I have, the original photo of that room, and that's you can imagine them having music performance right there in that room. So Frank was married to a woman named Sarah Chase, and she had, well, the two of them had 4 children: Henry, Anna Maud, Pierce, but there's many references to him being called Percy, and Alice being the youngest. So there was a rumor at one point that I had discovered through some of this research that said the house next door was built for Percy, but I couldn't find supporting documents for that. In fact, the earliest resident I found was a gentleman named Theodore Hall in 1883. He was a bookkeeper for Reed and Barton. He lived there with his wife, Sylvia, who was a local teacher. But that house was also quite large. It has a history, though. There was a fire at one point, and it was converted to just a single floor. So I found some images of it originally, but as it stands today, it's just the one floor, and it's lived in there by my neighbors. We share a driveway. The Fish didn't stay at the house for too long after their youngest, Alice, graduated high school. She went to Taunton High School. The next owner of the home was a gentleman named Frederick H. Gooch, and there's references in the census to his wife and his kids. So the earliest record I have of him living at the house was 1920, which he was approximately 48 at the time. And his middle name was Hudson, just like Henry Hudson Fish. I thought that was just a neat coincidence. Mr. Gooch was, quote-unquote, one of the best-known textile men in New England, according to his obituary. And he lived in the house with his wife, Ella, his daughter, Helen, his stepdaughter, Hannah, and his servant, Catherine, which I thought was cool that the house had a servant at that point. There was no reference to the Fishes having a servant, but this Frederick Gooch did. He put it on the census. Also, found it interesting, he was kind of like myself, where he lived in this house with just a bunch of women. He was the only man at the time. He was an agent of the Whittington Company. It's a mill close by, and at the time they did cotton. And from my understanding, he was pretty high up in that organization. By 1930, Mr. Gooch, at the ripe age of 68, had added his sister-in-law Clara to the household. But now, in the census, he indicated his stepdaughter Hannah as an additional servant and housekeeper. So I thought that was funny. So now he has 2 servants, but Hannah in particular, we're going to remember her endearingly as the manor's own Cinderella. So she must have gotten on his bad side. The house is set up as you'd expect one would be for this time. So it has, it's configured in such a way that there's dedicated servant access to the kitchen. There's a separate bathroom, separate bedroom on the second floor for the smaller staircase along the back. And that area of the house also has access to the massive cellar with outdoor access as well. So they had areas in the basement for storage for coal and dry vegetables with vents built into the foundation, which is still there today, which is pretty cool. Fred was a man of wealth as well. He enjoyed being part of the Taunton Yacht Club and a summer resident of Tiverton, Rhode Island, so he enjoyed his boating in the ocean. Mr. Gooch, though, from some of the research I found, he was no friend of the law, it seemed. 1923, he stood trial for vehicle homicide. He was accused of speeding at a blistering 20 miles per hour. That was according to a 14-year-old witness who claimed that he had 5,000 miles of driving experience himself. So again, this is 1923. Cars hadn't been around for very long at this point. But Mr. Gooch was accused of colliding with Elizabeth, depending on your pronunciation, Mahoney, and he killed her, supposedly dragging her under his rear wheel. I don't know the make and model of the vehicle. It wasn't referenced in the article. The weather, there was a quote of a witness that said the weather was cold, rainy night, greasy and nasty. The road was slippery and there was a kind of fog. And I can attest to that sometimes we do have some pretty thick fog in this area. I also like to imagine in the horse barn out back there being a 1920 Duesenberg or something like that, sitting in there instead of horses, since Mr. Gooch had upgraded from horses to a motorized vehicle. However, due to the poor witness handling and the questioning, there was a mistrial. There was no verdict. There was reference to them taking that 14-year-old witness outside and having cars drive by him and asking him to guess the speed that they were traveling, and he failed miserably. So there's a precedent there in terms of who you can call as an expert witness from that perspective. By 1935, Mr. Gooch passed away, and he's actually buried in town. I found the headstone. He's there with his whole family. So in 1940, his wife and sister-in-law both passed away. So on March 1st, 1943, however, which is nearly 10 years, so it's about 8 years after his death, the deed and estate of Mr. Gooch was sold to Richard W. Nelson and his wife Beatrice. So, just tracking some of those dates, if he was living here in 1942, or I should say, Mr. Richard Nelson was living here in 1942, but Ella, his wife, and sister-in-law Clara both passed away in 1940, the last known people to be alive that were in the previous deed. It's not clear to me what happened between those 2 years of 40 to 42, between when they died and when Mr. Nelson took residence. So either he lived here or the house is vacant. I'm not sure. Records show that Mr. Nelson lived in Montreal in 1935, but in 1940 he did take up a new position here, according to the census, which showed he also had 2 children, Richard Jr. and Karen. But Karen didn't have an age in a private residence in Montreal, so my guess is that she was born at this house because of that census. So he was roughly 39 years old since he was shown born in 1904 in his draft registration card. So he was Mr. Nelson was born in Kane, Pennsylvania. And this card, I thought, was also interesting that he didn't put his residential address. And I imagine he's trying to avoid something, maybe mail coming to his house, or them trying to find him immediately, that kind of thing. But that's all speculation on my part. But again, with those wars kind of looming. But somebody did scratch in 9 Rockland Street on the top of the card, and that's how I was able to find it. The card showed him working at Taunton State Hospital. So Mr. Nelson, he was actually a medical doctor. He worked at some highly rated establishments like the Grafton State Psychiatric Hospital and actually the Taunton State Asylum, which, if you look at the history of the Taunton State Asylum, it was actually called sort of like the lunatic hospital, which I thought was kind of funny. So he worked on rehabilitating people with mental illness. There were rumors that Dr. Nelson left shackles and chains behind on the 3rd floor, leading us to believe that maybe he brought his work home with him. But all just speculation. I have no proof of this. But it does make Halloween at the house fun. Not something I'm going to share with my children anytime soon, not maybe until a little bit older. Dr. Nelson ran into some legal issues himself, just like Mr. Gooch did. There was references to him. In 1956, he was accused, along with some of his colleagues, while at the Grafton State Hospital, by a woman named Mrs. Cranny. She claimed that Dr. Nelson and others deprived her of her right to perform religious services and sacrament at her dying brother's deathbed. And that, quote, depriving the descendant of an immortal salvation and his next of kin the peace of mind, also depriving her own right of assembly to worship God at the deathbed, coffin, and even the tomb of the deceased, which is kind of weird to me that somebody like a doctor could keep you from going to the tomb of your deceased brother, but that's what she was accusing. Her brother was the patient at the mental institute, so He had some issues. But she posed that it was a violation of the Civil Rights Act, which was, I believe, pretty new at this point. This is 1956, so it hadn't been around for very long. But by grouping her religious beliefs as part of that was the reason for the refusal. So the judge threw the case out. So there was a precedent for that. So this is another interesting story that I found about Mr. Nelson. He was one of the more obscure people that I could find in the history of the house, but since he was working at this hospital, Harold McMillan, he was a former Air Force officer. He had pretended to be another doctor named William Blackwell for 9 months. 9 months he was impersonating this person. So McMillan, he was originally a married man with a child in Portland, Maine. But while he was impersonating this other person, he actually managed to marry a different person and have a child with this person. And he wasn't doing it for very long, but he was pretending to be his resident at the hospital. But prior to him pretending to be that, he was actually a patient at a mental ward in Maryland, according to his mother. When asked for comment, though, this is where Dr. Nelson comes in. The only reference that I could find to Dr. Nelson publicly in terms of the newspapers was he stated that Mr. McMillan went to all of his classes, lectures, and even saw patients while he was impersonating this doctor, and that nobody questioned his medical knowledge, which is kind of crazy. But after Richard Nelson left the house, the Harnoys took possession. So on September 20th, 1949, Xavier and Rita Harnoy closed on the sale of the house from Dr. Nelson. It's not clear, but Dr. Nelson's brief stint in the house being the shortest lived, he abutted the longest known occupants, the Harnoys. They lived here the longest. So X and Rita had 2 children, Ron and Joyce, which were born, Ron, who's still alive, was born in 1944, to my understanding. And he drives by the house nearly every day in his truck. Just checking in on it. Joyce has passed on, but her husband actually lives in a house across the street. And we wound up getting it from him, a trust that was left to him when we purchased it, along with Ron. And he checks in occasionally as well. He's a nice gentleman. So. The eclectic Harnoy family loved the arts just like the fish, so it kind of brought it all the way back, which I thought was cool. They liked antiques. There's comments about Xavier doing magic, and both of them really liking dancing, ballroom dancing, that kind of thing. But Rita's claim to fame, so she obviously owned a company called Rags and Riches. It was a fabric store. But prior to that, she worked at the Taunton State Hospital, and that's where she had met Xavier, where they had lived in Taunton their entire lives. And they also, she also worked at the local Taunton Inn, and that there's some relevance there. So she was mostly known, however, for being a local artist. So sort of like Eliza Fish, she was big into art. She painted a lot, and she was a member of the Taunton Art Association. So many of my neighbors actually state they still have her paintings hanging in their homes, which I think is pretty cool. In 1949, the pair, X and Rita, applied for a license to operate this large estate as a lodging house. My guess is it's because of their experience working at the inn. So they almost essentially attempted to convert this big house into a sort of like a bed and breakfast style inn. The house is parsed into 5 apartments, I believe. And there's evidence throughout the basement that there were separate utilities, there were gas lines and electric separation and all that kind of thing. The house went through substantial changes throughout their 69 years of ownership. As you can imagine, that's a long time. So throughout that time, much of the modernization occurred, including siding, rebuilding the deck, which I believe had to be rebuilt due to termites. Could be wrong, but that's my understanding. They made it all into brick. They paved the driveway at one point. You can see in some of the older photos it was paved, but it's no longer paved. There were retaining walls on the property put up, updates to heating and plumbing and electrical systems. You name it, they probably updated it. The most significant changes, however, occurred after a fire on the third floor in 2008. So this is 128 years after the house was built. There was a fire on the third floor fireplace. And to the credit of the Taunton Fire Department, they managed to save the house, which is insane to me in some of the photos that I've seen. But that led to a complete renovation of the house. So they kept some of the original pieces of artwork and those sorts of things, but they brought it all the way down to the studs, the entire house. They updated the electrical. I think there was maybe one or two rooms that didn't get brought all the way to the studs, but for the most part, the entire house was redone. New windows, insulation, electrical, you name it. They went through the whole thing. So after or I should say, just before the fire, Rita had passed away in October of 2007. So she wasn't here during the fire, but Xavier was. After that fire, after the renovation, Xavier wound up passing in November of 2011, and then again passing the house to their son, Ron, and Mr. Christensen across the street. So that's the history of the house. In 2018, December, we took the house. We bought the house, and since then we've been making some updates. Nothing significant, but we added mini splits for air conditioning, that kind of thing. It's a big house, so but mostly just outdoor stuff. We do have some plans to do some indoor renovations, but try to keep it to some of the historical charm that it has. We're not looking to completely rebuild everything. Keep things as original as we possibly can. I am interested to see if I can find more details in terms of the layout of the house, so that I know how things were laid out. Because when it was converted to the lodging house by Rita and Xavier, it's not clear to me what the layout was. They had put up entire walls. They had made bedrooms, kitchens, bathrooms, and everything else. So it's hard to know exactly what the layout of the house was, especially in the backyard as well. It's hard to know, whether when the foundation was put in versus some of the retaining walls, that kind of information. So there you have it. That's the history of the house. I'm going to end this with just some cool pictures that I had found throughout. Some of the Fish family children, some of my children, some of the newer photos of the home, some of the things that it's gone through. So hopefully you enjoyed that.